Today, we're covering content found in Lecture 13 entitled The Seesaw of Desire, found in Seminar 1. In this video, I'll address the following questions based on content from this lecture. 1. What is the relationship between the ego and the subject? 2. What is meant by the lecture's title, The Seesaw of Desire? And 3. How do we understand masochism as it relates to the imaginary and symbolic? If you enjoy this video, please like it and consider subscribing to my channel. What is the relationship between the ego and the subject? The difficulty in addressing this question is that while the ego seems to arrive first in development, one cannot understand the ego except in relation to the subject. As we discussed in a previous video, development takes place within a history, and that history is not chronological, but rather logical. However, we need to begin somewhere. So by fiat for this occasion, let's say that at the beginning was the misfit. By this, I'm referring to an essential difference between animals and humans, and that difference is what sets off the distinct trajectory for the subject and ego in the human animal. Animals structure their environments through a limited number of innate schemas or gestalten. These gestalten fit neatly within the possibilities and limitations of that real environment. Humans, in contrast, are misfits when it comes to the structuration of their world. Rather than deploy a fairly straightforward libidinal investment, humans deploy an anarchy of elementary drives, partial behavior patterns, special libidinal investments that leads to a miscarriage between the world and oneself. And so, while these words are mine and not Lacan's, what seems to emerge at this early stage of the human person is a kind of proto-subject, a subject that is libidinally unstructured and who can be captivated by perceptual lures. It will take a while for the libidinal subject to appropriate language as its own. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that the subject, who is generally identified as a linguistic phenomenon, is bathed in language from the very beginning. So we never truly arrive at a pure animality of the human. What can be said of this subject as far as this lecture is concerned is that it seeks recognition of its desire. This is not a problem for animals who aim at the satisfaction of desire rather than its recognition. The human animal looks outside of itself rather than deploy ready-made internal strategies for satisfaction. But in looking outside of itself, it does not seek a direct satisfaction of desire through a natural object, but rather, in a sense, desires desire. And it seeks to find its desire more so than achieve the desire's satisfaction. This search leads the subject to identify its desire in the other's desire. Now, although the subject seeks this recognition, there is a part of the subject that refuses to know anything of this desire, or more accurately, is functioning as a misrecognition of desire by identifying itself in the image of the other. It is in this misrecognizing desire in the image of the other, and in particular the other's body, that one achieves an alienated representation of oneself. Why would there be a part of the subject that seeks out this alienated identity? The imaginary identification offers the subject the semblance of mastery that has yet to be attained in it. We must keep in mind that we're born prematurely and in a state of impotence. Our lives are completely dependent upon the other. The other offers us the kind of accomplishment we cannot give to ourselves. As such, we seek to identify with that outside of us that possesses this mastery. The mirror stage encapsulates that attempt to possess what we do not have, first by seeing ourselves in the other through projection, and then assuming the image of the other into ourselves, but ourselves in an alienated, misrecognized form. Just as the mirror doesn't reflect exactly what we give to it, but rather returns to us an inverted image of ourselves. There is something of us in the image, but also something added to it that's not ours. This element of the subject that performs this function is called the ego. It's identified as a static form of the subject, stuck in a set of identifications, all the while vacillating between a kind of love or infatuation with the other who presents us with our ideal ego, and a hatred toward the other who serves as the site of our alienation. The next lecture will explain a little bit more what accounts for this vacillation. So now how do we understand the seesaw of desire in light of this? The seesaw of desire here is the back and forth exchange between oneself and the other, whereby one projects their fragmented desire onto the other, or as Lacan calls it, feeds the ideal ego, and then one in turn identifies with the image of the other and assumes it as oneself. This happens over and over again in a successive series of identifications that leads the ego to be likened to the many layers of an onion.
Layers! Onions have layers.
This exchange is deceptive, however, as it produces an alienating effect. What has been assumed as one's own is fundamentally a misrecognition of one's own desire, because it's the desire that is in the other that we receive back. It's also a desire of the other, which is what facilitates love and hate. Ultimately, it will be language that intervenes here to mediate the recognition of desire and broker a peace with the other. Doing so breaks the subject free from the ossifying identifications of the ego. The aim of psychoanalysis will be to consider what knowledge lies behind this misrecognition, a knowledge that lies within the subject. Though I don't think this is made explicit in this lecture, I believe this knowledge is referring to the truth of the subject's desire. Free association assists this process by freeing up one's relation to language, depriving the subject of its fixed conventions for conversing with the other. This has the effect of loosening up the ego's grip upon the subject. A question is later raised in this lecture, and it's the question we'll end with. What is masochism in light of this model? How do we understand it? Lacan locates it in the overlap between imaginary and symbolic. The absence of the loved object comes to be substituted by the introduction of the symbolic plane. The imaginary loved object can now be mastered symbolically by the subject, who now derives pleasure in bringing the object into existence and then just as quickly disappearing it through the use of language. The famous case of Freud's grandson in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is used to illustrate this. The young boy, missing his mother, substitutes her for a game involving a cotton reel that he makes come and go in his movements and through the vocalizations fort da, far here. Now we must recall that Freud talks about this example in a work that is developing the concept of the death drive. In that work, we come to understand how destructive repetitions arise in an attempt to master painful experiences. As such, it provides a rationale for how one could receive pleasure by inducing their own pain. Thank you for watching. You might have noticed that I've been switching up presentation styles in these videos to find the most effective means for communicating what is difficult material. Feel free to leave a comment if you wish in terms of what approaches you found the most helpful. I'll see you next time.